It is quite rare these days to see a social movement succeeding, achieving its aims, even if we did not achieve every single one of our aims. The fact that we managed to block this tuition hike represents the strength of our movement and represents what is possible to achieve from now on. It's also important to recognize that we can indeed achieve things even if we haven't completely reversed the commodification of education, even if we haven't challenged neoliberalism in a way that manages to reverse some other reforms. I think, well, first of all, the fact that we achieved our aims will mean that thousands will be able to continue to go to university, mean that we will be able to build on this momentum going forward, and also the fact that we awakened the political conscience of so many Quebecers, be them students or the rest of the population, is extremely encouraging for the next steps.
And to me, our greatest victory lies in this much broader sense of politicizing a whole generation, of course. I've seen people who had never really been interested in the news, even starting reading and watching the news and taking position and debating political issues, and that in the longer term I think is our biggest victory.
We politicized a generation but also formed a core group of radicals. The strike radicalized many whom had no further objectives than simply blocking this tuition hike, realized that the tuition hike was part of a much broader problem, and thus will continue challenging the institutions that we need to challenge going forward. Okay.
What do you think was the most difficult part of the strike of the last year? The most difficult and the easiest.
Well, there's a lot of behind-the-scenes work that you don't necessarily see watching a broadcast of a demonstration, especially prior to the beginning of the strike, which started in February of 2012, a little under a year ago now. And this campaign lasted for 2 years. And back then we could only count on so many people, a few hundred people, a few hundred committed activists on different campuses in order to mobilize for the strike over 2 years, mobilizing for small actions, mobilizing for one-day strikes. And that work was grueling. Many of our activists were already extremely tired when the strike started. Just mobilizing ahead, preparing the campaigns, and of course preparing for this objective of going on strike. The mere fact of going on strike was the result of 2 years of prep work. It was a victory in itself. And after that, thankfully, with the strike being so participatory, we formed, so many new activists that could relay this work and do it during the strike, so that it was a kind of a roulement.
Yeah, shift.
Yeah.
Yeah, and well, to me the easiest, I'll start with the easiest part, was at the very beginning of the strike, winning the strike votes. In the first place, we actually kind of apprehended that moment, because in the past we have had a few, failures. In 2007, the last time we had tried to go on general strike. Even before that, we had some failures, and after. And so we really kind of apprehended that moment, but it turned out to be much easier than we thought it would be. And to me, that was the easiest part, actually starting the strike. The prior work was hard, as Jérémie said, but the very votes themselves were not so hard to win.
As long as you get those first few strike votes,
yeah,
then the momentum builds itself.
Yeah.
And the movement waits for a reaction from the government. Since the government did not react early on by extending a hand to students, was very easy to mount momentum and mount our numbers, increase our numbers, sorry, ahead of the 22nd of March demonstration.
Yeah, and the hardest part to me was, well, it's basically twofold, but related. Physical fatigue and psychological fatigue as well. Well, there have been several waves of fatigue, like in April, before the negotiations started, after 9 weeks, people were kind of exhausted. Then we got then the negotiations started, we got kicked out. That just gave us a little more energy, just out of anger, I would say. And later on in May, right before Law 12, Bill 78, there were injunctions everywhere. People were spending most of their time on campuses trying to block courses and stuff, and there were really like harsh confrontations with the police and other students as well. That was hard, like psychologically, emotionally hard. And then they passed Bill 78, and the outrage it provoked and the show of solidarity that that happened in the population then just gave us another boost of energy. But then in June, when the semesters were suspended, we had no more classes to block, and it was maintaining a certain level of mobilization, because we knew we could not let this die out and just start everything magically in August. So we had to maintain something. We organized some demonstrations. They were much smaller.
Well,
much depends, but they were
50 to 80,000 people.
Yeah. When compared to May 22nd,
pretty good.
And May 22nd was 300,000, just to give an idea. Those were our standards back then. And so they were smaller in comparison to the previous major ones. But we did a tour throughout the province, which helped, sensibilize the population to the issues, because they had mostly been watching this on television. They did not really know who we were, what we wanted. They just had this very, sometimes negative, inaccurate picture of the movement. So we kind of broke some cliches there. And yeah, so that helped us overcome the demobilization.
Can you explain very quickly what is the 78 law and why exactly it was passed?
Yeah. Well, Bill 78 was passed in a particular context where we had gone on 4 rounds of negotiations that had not succeeded in suspending or ending the strike. And at that point, the Minister of Education resigned, Lynn Beauchamp, resigned clearly because she did not want to employ stronger tactics than the daily police repression. That stronger tactic was state repression in the form of this repressive legislation, Bill 78. Bill 78 is a classic back-to-work legislation in essence. It resembles a back-to-work legislation imposed on trade unions when they go on strike in order to break picket lines. And it had 3 effects. It made demonstrations illegal if the route had not been publicized 8 hours in advance with the police. It also disallowed picket lines on campuses, and no exception to that. And it suspended the semesters of those who had been striking to August. Now this is the essential part of Bill 78. It was mostly unheard of, and it wasn't talked about in media that the third tried suspending the semester, but in effect, it was the most effective part of that bill. The strike has a very strong economic effect. Even without the demonstrations, even without the direct action, even with no mobilization whatsoever, simply going on strike means that there's a threat of canceling the semester, losing a semester, which would see the graduating students go on for another semester, which means that they would take the seat of a graduating student from high school if you go to Cégep, or for Cégep if you go to university. And that creates a gulf, which also creates tremendous economic damage. Now, of course, the strike itself also sustained mobilization, daily mobilizations, demonstrations, and so on. And so it was important for the government to suspend the semester in order for that threat to be removed and for the mobilization to die down. But the first two parameters of Bill 78 meant that the mobilization would increase tremendously over a span of 5, 6, 7, maybe 3 weeks after the bill passed, with the support of the CAC, which is a nationalist right-wing party, and the entirety of the Liberal caucus. With a new education minister in place, this was her first act, passing the bill, and the effect it had was tremendous. 300,000 students going on this, citizens going on this demonstration on May 22nd, the largest demonstration in the history of the country, of Canada. And this was because it was so obviously repressive. It was so obviously undemocratic in a country that prides itself on certain institutions of democracy. There was no way to defend that bill, and the people who had previously been passively in support of students or not caring much at all about the strike suddenly felt the need to defend the sacred institution of the right to protest, the right to express an opinion, and so they went in and to the demonstration in massive numbers.
Can you...
And I might add that such special laws have been used in the past by Quebec government several times, but it was only the second time that it was used not in the context of a workers' strike. And the previous time had been in the late 1940s or early 1950s, when the most conservative premier in the history of Quebec, Maurice Duplessis, had passed a law called La Loi du Canada, the padlock law, to prevent communist organizations. So our own version of McCarthyism. So that was the only previous example of using a special law not in the context of a workers' strike. So
it should also be mentioned that CLASS was the only organization that chose to defy that law. We organized the Congress a few days after the bill passed and decided that we would organize a press conference and call on the population to go to this demonstration whose route was not going to be publicized, which broke the law. And it was an illegal demonstration. So May 22nd was in fact the largest act of civil disobedience in the history of Canada. But most people didn't care. Most people came up to people who wore CLASS T-shirts during the demonstration and asked, you know, where's the illegal route? Where can I protest illegally? I want to protest illegally. While the trade unions had very cautiously organized their own demonstration on that day, that turned right on the same street that we turned left, which is ironically demonstrates the political divide between the labor unions and us. The history shows that 250,000 people turned left and a few union flags turned right. It was probably my proudest moment of the strike.
CLASS was attacked by the media, we could say, and by the politicians, saying that it was a pro-violence organization and maybe pro-disobedience because of this position relating to the 78 law. What do you have to say about that and about the position of the other federation of student unions?
Yeah. Well, I'm proud to say that we are pro-disobedience.
Yeah.
I think we can agree to that one, because when a law is fundamentally unjust, and this has been theorized by so many great political thinkers, it has to be broken. It has to be. It's the only way to contest and undermine the legitimacy of that law. It's breaking it over and over and over again, and it is what Quebecers did, and it is what the class did. So I'm very proud that we're pro-civil disobedience.
For the violence issue, we are not pro-violence, but
we're pro-diversity of tactics.
Yeah, and yeah, but that's been the object of a heated debate when the negotiations started, the first round of negotiations with the government. Their condition for our taking part in the negotiation, even though we represented more than half of the students on strike, the condition was that we condemn violence. They had succeeded in dividing the student movement in 2005 on that issue, so they wanted to repeat that. Well, first of all, when we got thrown out, the other unions followed because they knew they had no leverage without us. And then we had a congress to discuss this. And we came out with this very precise position on violence, saying you condemn violence only when it's deliberately targeted at individuals.
Except in the cases of self-defense.
Except in cases of self-defense. And apparently that was enough. So that's our position on violence.
It's ironic because that technically allows us not to denounce anything or to play on. Anyway.
And about the position of the other federations?
Yeah. Well, they're always easy they're always ready to condemn violence if it suits them. They don't have to deal with
they don't have democratic mechanisms,
first of all. So they don't have to consult anybody before, condemning violent acts, or so-called violent acts. And
feel free to talk more about them than not just about this issue.
Oh, we're very happy to talk more about them these days.
Well, we're less cautious now than we were like 6 months ago.
We held ourselves back during the strike under the guise of solidarity.
But now
we can finally talk about them at length.
But that's it. So they have less democratic,
ways of functioning.
Ways of function, and the ways of action do not involve generally situations where there could be violent act. They would rather be in a room sipping coffee with the education minister and in the street. So they don't see themselves so much as social movements more than interest groups.
Yeah,
so,
their default mode of organizing is consultation, is lobbying. It's lobbying. And they were pushed into going on strike by the fact that there was such a strong push in civil society. And generally, there was an air of going on strike. In February, very early on, we had several tens of thousands of students on strike, and there was a domino effect where all of their unions went on strike, even though they had not explicitly called for the strike to happen or organized much to make it happen.
We organized some of their own member associations instead of them.
There was such a strong will from the membership, which is not represented at all by the federations, since they don't have general assemblies, they don't have mechanisms in order to properly represent any kind of body, any kind of students group. And so the federations were stuck in that awkward position where they were now sponsoring a movement which were out of their control completely. People were doing civil disobedience, people were doing direct action, blockading banks. This is obviously not something that they had planned for. This is not something that they agreed with. And they usually do not hold back when it comes time to condemning such acts in order to gain a favorable position in their negotiations with the government. This is what they did in 2005. But now, since the class was so powerful, since it had more than 100,000 students on strike, it represented more than half of the strikers, it could not divide the student movement that way.
And some of the very members of the student federations did not follow their leadership as much, you know. They did not have a hold on their members as much. Well, we didn't have any, but like the class, the way it works, the direct democracy, of course there's a political line that gets, you know, fleshed out of the debates and stuff, and that's what most of the students, even non-affiliated, even TASEC, FERC, or FEC members, kind of related more to that narrative and to the narrative of the federations. So even if they had negotiated without us, if they had called for the end of the strike, chances are we would have stayed on strike, and well, the situation would not have been so different, in my opinion. But it was important to maintain a solidarity back then, and well, on several occasions, the FEC president, Léo Bureau-Blouin, was
who's
tempted.
now an MP for party in power.
He attempted to break the solidarity. Not for the sake of breaking it, of course, but you know, to appear as more respectable, and more responsible, and more moderate. So this is a compromise. He was very.
He was trying to get on the negotiations table and negotiate alone with the government, while his group, the FEC, represented only 4 unions on strike, less than 20,000 students, I believe, compared to a body of striking students of 170,000. So. The government laughed at him, basically, at that time. And now the true face of the federations is evident. They're now calling for more cuts into education funding. A first round of cuts was announced 2 weeks ago, and they put out a press release very recently that said, no, we want more cuts. They're not even protesting the cuts. They want more cuts under the guise that there is waste in the university system, which is true.
But we
can never solve anything with cuts. They're pushing for a tuition freeze in the summit on education, where every option is on the table, saying that free education is not possible, is unresponsible, etc., 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 echoing the discourse that Léo Bureau-Blouin held during the strike. Léo Bureau-Blouin is now a PQMP and is responsible for mediating the summit on education. You see the very strong links enjoyed by the federations with power.
Can you tell me a little bit about the history of ASSÉ and how did it work to enlarge it in this coalition? Talking about really, do you do only student activism? Do you only talk about specifically student issues, or you have other issues on the table? And also, because this has been in Europe at least an issue, are you identified by others with extreme left-wing parties or organizations in particular, or are you seen as independent?
Well, this is it's
a big question.
It's a big question. So first of all, we were founded in 2001, after, or in the midst, just right after, I don't have the specific date, the Quebec Summit for Pan-American Free Trade Zone. There was a lot of mobilization against that, and the students took part in that, and the most left-wing student associations realized that they needed a provincial union to represent them. So that's when ASSÉ was founded. So our first political action as an organization was not on the specifically student matter, and this has been constantly. This has been constant in our history. Well, it's a pretty young history for ASSÉ only, but we have always taken position and taken part in demonstrations for subjects such as Palestine, women's rights, workers' rights, and so on. So, of course, we have demands concerning education. That's our main focus, but it's not the end of the story, not at all. So we consider ourselves part of a global movement. But before ASSÉ was founded, there were other organizations in the past that represented the left-wing, most activist, radical, say, part of the student movement.
I would say even further, a strong syndicalist tradition based on those very same General Assemblies that function basically the same way as they did in 1969.
Yeah. So, and our history goes back even further. Before 1969, but yeah. So how did we broaden the coalition? What the experience was attempted in 2005 with a certain success. So the idea was we wanted to create a left-wing radical or more activist pole for the strike. So we defined a certain number of demands, and we called for other student associations who wanted to share those demands and create a critical mass with us, only for a specific period of time that they could. They just needed the process to do so was much easier than joining on a permanent basis, and it was for those associations who didn't want to join on a more permanent basis. But this has proven to be an excellent tool for growing the organization itself. Before the 2005 strike, we were 20,000 in ASSÉ. Some months after, we were 35,000. Before the strike this year, we were 40,000. Now we're almost
70,000.
We're
the second biggest group, student group in Quebec.
So we have almost doubled our numbers in a single year on the permanent basis. So that's how we proceeded.
The 2005 coalition spokesperson is right behind you.
Yeah.
Working on an article.
Yeah, with earphones.
Montreal is a small town.
And when we do interviews in cafes, he's always there. So it's a constant. What was the last question? It was
about what the government and the media did to stick some kind of like left-wing organizations are controlling the movement.
They tried to say that the PQ, the party that's now in power, was controlling us, which is very funny because we dislike the PQ pretty much the same as we do for the Liberal Party. Yeah. So we are very, very mistrust.
Skeptical.
Yes. We're skeptical towards them.
Well, there's generally a mistrust towards political parties. In fact, we have a very strong stance on collaboration with political parties, which is not collaborate with them. And this is something we've kept on doing, even as the strike entered an election period in August, which was an awkward moment for class, as it was a major political player that was not participating directly into the electoral process. It was not calling for students to vote. It was not calling for students to support the parties that you would expect them to support, like the PQ or Québec Solidaire, which is the Quebec equivalent of maybe Syriza, a left-wing
Bloco de Esquerda in Portugal.
Well, there you go. European references. No, it did not support any of those political parties, and in fact we just continued on spreading our manifesto and the ideas that it contained during that period, and went on a massive demonstration on the 22nd, as every single party told us not to mobilize, except Québec Solidaire.
We were there. We were doing parallel work, which was really awkward. like we could not comment on subjects. Like when there was an issue, in the very first days of the campaign, I remember being at the time the press secretary, the PR guy. They called us for every subject that would be the day's news, and for the very first days I had to repeat over and over again that we're not commenting on the electoral campaign. We're not taking part into this, and I had to hammer it in their heads, and even towards the end, some journalists were not really aware that we did not want to have anything to do with this. It was awkward. That's something we have to reflect on, I guess. But
I'd like to give you an example. One of our spokespersons, Jean Reynolds, made a mistake in speaking to a journalist during the electoral campaign. And this gives you an idea of the strategic importance of class at the time, of the weight that everything it did carried. The journalist asked, I think he was making what was the question?
What happens if you don't like the?
Yeah, what happens if you don't like? Will you accept the election results? And then Jean replied, well, we'll see if we accept the election results in Congress. As if class had to approve the election results for it for a government to be formed. We did not find it funny, but now I think we cannot find it.
Yeah, it was a mistake from her, and she was misinterpreted, but
Well, going back to your question, I think it's also worthwhile to mention trade unions, which are relatively powerful in this province. It's one of the most unionized states or nations in North America, certainly. Maybe the most unionized. Very, very strong trade unions. Also, like most trade unions around the world, they have become very, very corporatist business units that run huge hedge funds rather than mobilize or get involved or be democratic in any kind of way. Although it varies from union to union. Now, trade unions backed us from the very early beginnings, and this was very helpful. The most helpful thing, of course, as they were not really mobilizing machines, was their financial support. We received lots and lots and lots of donations, especially from unions in the rest of Canada and in the United States. And this allowed us to survive, because we ran out of money in the first month. We're a very small organization, especially in terms of financial needs. And of course this led media and the government to use this as a way to say, they're controlled by the trade unions. Trade unions are not very well liked in this province. But in fact, again, like with political parties, our relationship with trade unions was always a little rocky, not always cordial. Of course, there are different tendencies represented in the trade union movement, like ours.
But then one thing that happened during the strike is that people at the basis felt that we were teaching them a lesson, and it kind of went up the scales of the trade unions, and even to the point of president of a major trade union. Back then he resigned in September, I think. Louis Roy, president of, I think, the second largest trade union in Quebec, the CSN. He said something like, we have to draw some teachings from the students. We have to learn from them.
And evidently they did, because on the 22nd of May, when it came time to disobey Bill 78, when it came time to show that these were organizations that still had political chops, some courage, they chose not to disobey the law. And they suffered heavily from that, because their membership was walking with us.
So things are changing in the unions, I think, but you see that in the long run. Yeah.
One last question is about the future. So you approve the campaign for to mobilize for free education in Quebec, I suppose. Can you tell me a little bit about this? How does it work in general? You know.
Well, as you mentioned earlier, as I mentioned earlier, actually, we do recognize that cancelling the tuition hike was a victory, yet it does not put an end to the commodification of education. One of the ways to significantly challenge this user-payer conception of higher education is by removing the financial barrier to accessibility, which are tuition hikes, by removing the price of education. And this is why, after the strike, we felt that the next logical move was to campaign for la gratuité scolaire, free education. And this campaign is ongoing. The PQ is now organizing a summit in education, which assembles pretty much everyone from the labor unions, the student associations, to the business councils, everyone that the government identifies as a stakeholder in higher education. And this is the idea that we'll push for during the summit, but also outside the summit, because if there's one thing we learned from our several years of involvement in the student movement and 40 years of history is that you do not win anything by going around these summits. They're a great way to push an idea forward, to propel it into the open, but how we'll achieve gains, further gains, is by mobilizing, is by going in the streets, by continuing to do what we've always did. And so this mobilizing aspect is an incredibly important part of this campaign for free education. And during that summit, we will hold a massive demonstration to push for free education. There will be other general strikes. There will be other great political moments of awakening in the future. And I think what we have to do now is to build for them, is to make them possible. It won't come in the next few months. Probably not. Maybe it will. But we just need to continue pushing for the ideas that we've always pushed. We cannot rest on our laurels now. We have challenged the neoliberal consensus in a way few social movements have achieved. And this energy, because we have permanent structures, because we have these strong organizations, will not die down so easily.
Yeah, and for free education, I remember back in 2005, when we discussed this among ourselves, it was, a common thing to agree on. But as soon as we walked out of the schools and talked to other people, we looked like aliens, basically. Talking about free education, what a utopia. And one of the things of this strike is that it opened a space for discussion and in a more general way with the society as itself. Now free education is something that is talked about more and more, at least a lot more than it was 1 year ago.
It's never been talked about so much.
Yeah, now it's part of the words journalists use, which was not the case a year ago, 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 7 years ago. Now it is. It's a possibility.
We've put it back on the map, and it hasn't happened since
the
tentaran in the 60s and the 70s, and the movements in the 70s. Yeah.
So I'm cautiously optimistic, and well, we cannot count on the PQ to do it on itself. It will either require another party taking power or a general strike, but it will certainly not be the PQ by itself that will do it. It will require pressure.
And that's obvious given that they've withdrawn on every single vaguely left-wing position they had since they came into power, and it's only been like 3 months.
A little bit more. Yeah, almost 4 months.
Okay. Just one last thing. If you have something to say to European students or Portuguese students.
Well, in Portugal, you don't need reasons to mobilize more than you have at the moment. Just keep on mobilizing and just
we pay
doing what you're
1,000
doing.
euros
Okay.
per year with 400 euros per month minimum wage.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, well, keep on mobilizing. You're already doing a great work, a good job, and this, in Europe it's much different. Like, I was in Germany not even a month ago, and in Germany the situation is much different than Portugal, but the stakes are much more at a European level, and it's hard to mobilize at a European level. Like, there was this day of general strike, but that was mostly in Portugal, Greece, in the south, and for only one day that's not much of leverage in order to change policy at the European level. So you guys have a much harder time than we do at changing policy, I guess.
Well, we both went to Europe this fall at the invitation of student organizations there. I went to the Czech Republic and Britain. It's striking how much the issues faced by students in both these countries are similar.
Yeah.
Because, as you said, they're part of this Bologna process applied at the European level. Now, all things become confused, basically. The Bologna process, the European austerity, and it's not happening at the European level. There must be links made between those different movements that are all fighting the same issues. And it might even be easier than us linking up with English Canadian students, because the policies are crafted by the same bureaucrats in Brussels. And I see a very strong need for those movements to link up, to engage in dialogue and coordination, as we've seen during the general strike on the 14th.
Okay.
And never underestimate the power of organizations and structures.
Democracy. Direct democracy.